Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to my channel. This is your host, Sunny Neo. I'm recording this lecture because I did it before the spring break, but the recording of the video, the quality was lacking, so I need to redo this again, and hopefully I can redo this lecture even better than the original one. Anyway, thank you for tuning in to my lecture today, and thank you to all those people who came last time that I did it. It was fantastic that so many of you showed up, showed me so much support, and I will continue doing this lecture throughout my high school career now. And so yeah, let's get back to this topic. Today I'm going to talk about briefly about the Japanese suicide and special attack corps called Kamikaze. And I will start off with a movie clip from a Japanese war movie, which is called Eternal Zero. Hopefully you can enjoy this. Alright, so what you just saw was a clip from the Japanese war movie, The Eternal Zero, and it was a great movie. I hope maybe you have time, you can watch it. So yeah, that was a depicting of the Special Attack Corps, and this is the subject that we're talking about today. So the full name of this Special Attack Corps is called, in Japanese, Shimpu Tokubitsu Kokitai. And when it was formed in World War II, it was called Shimpu, pronounced by its kanji name. But through the popular culture, we just call it by its hiragana, called Kamikaze. So usually nowadays we just call it Kamikaze. And that was for the first two characters, and for the later characters, it is just Special Attack Corps. So from the name we can see it's a really different, unconventional way of attacking. Basically, the pilots need to crash his plane onto the enemy target, onto the enemy ship. So it is a completely abnormal thing to happen in even in a setting of a war that was completely unheard of. But this happened in World War II in Japan. And as you can see here, it is a famous picture of the young Japanese pilots, and I will come back to that picture at the end. So, what is the origin of this name, Kamikaze? Kamikaze means divine wind. So this was actually because the Mongols invaded Japan twice in 1274 and 81. It was between the Kublai Khan versus the Kamakura shogunate. So the Mongols, along with some Koreans and Chinese, sent their huge wooden fleets across the sea, and they landed into Japan. For the first time, the 74 one, the Mongol invasion forces actually landed onto the mainland Japan, but they got kind of a stalemate with the Japanese, because the Japanese really held them on the shore. So they were trying to escape. At the dawn of that day, before they were trying to sail, there was a huge storm, a huge typhoon hit them with all force that basically most of the Mongol fleet were destroyed into pieces. And basically the same thing happened again in 81, while this time the Mongols not even actually landed on Japan. Before that, they were completely wiped out by typhoon. So the Japanese call those two typhoons Kamikaze because they think it was the divine power from the god that helped them to overcome this overwhelming Mongol invasions. And so the Japanese in World War II named their Special Attack Corps as Kamikaze, as to thinking the same thing, that maybe we have the chance to turn things around for us. Maybe the god is still giving us a chance to win this war. and I'm going to give you some context as to why this corps actually was funded. So, in 1944, after the first 2 years of conflict in the Pacific, especially with in June 42, the Battle of Midway, and then subsequently the battles for the Solomon Islands campaigns, the Japanese gradually lost their strategic advancement. They turned into a strategic defensive position, while the Americans gained upper hand on the strategic levels. So the Americans were developing this strategy called island hopping. And so basically there were two routes. One is, as you can see from this picture, from the southern route is the from the Solomon Islands on the way to New Guinea, and then up to Philippines, and eventually maybe land into French Indochina in order to link up with the British and Chinese forces there, and then push the Japanese out of mainland China. Or the southern route, which was from the middle of the Pacific, hopping onto those small islands, and then get to Japan eventually. So the southern route was proposed especially by the commander-in-chief of the army, MacArthur. He was the defender of Philippines in 1941 when the Japanese came down there and captured the whole island. He basically escaped the invasion, and then he promised the people of Philippines and the soldiers left on the island that he will come back later on. And so he was a strong proposer of the southern approach to Japan, because as maybe you understand this, for the southern islands here, especially with Borneo, Malaya, and New Guinea, there were a lot of natural resources. Those were the targets that the Japanese really go off, that really set their goal for this whole war, to gain control of these natural resources and to benefit themselves. So the Japanese value those islands, and MacArthur, one, because he want the Philippines back. Two, on the way he can also keep the Japanese out of those natural resources islands, basically helping the war effort in that way. But the Navy, especially with its commander-in-chief Nimitz, proposes central road to the middle road. The idea was it was a more straightforward approach to the problem. As you can see, it's closer to mainland Japan, and so the idea was the closer you get to Japan, the more airfields you build on those tiny islands, the easier the American air forces can launch their long-range bombers to hit Japan directly, and also with their escort fighters, so that the planes can take off from those small tiny islands like Okinawa or Iwo Jima and those places to hit Japan directly, and then those planes can also land back to those islands to resupply and prepare for the next battle. So which route did the Americans choose? Well, the thing is, the Americans had so much industrial production at the time, so it was overwhelmingly, crazily high at the time. So the Americans actually say, well, whatever, we just do both of them. So the Army and the Navy really coordinated excellently on this war, and so that they conduct both routes altogether. So this is the American island hopping strategies. So the problem for the Japanese was that while the Americans are coming by island, they are approaching the several vital, crucial islands that they had, especially with those natural resources in the south. The Japanese need them to exploit those resources from these islands and then transport them back to mainland Japan, because all you got in Japan was the factories for aircraft, armories, and shipyards. They all need resources, but they don't have those resources in the mainland. So all those resources coming from the south need to get onto the transport, get onto the convoys, and then all the way sent back to mainland Japan. The Americans are advancing while, and so they were intercepting all the transport. So the mainland get lesser and less resources by each day. So the production of more planes was shut down, and that was really bad for Japan. And even worse for Japan was that not only just they had less production than the Americans, they had less experienced veteran pilots anymore. And because the Battle of Midway and the subsequent battle for the Solomon Islands, those battles actually did bad for the Japanese, was that they lost too many great pilots that they had from the beginning of the war. So most of the veteran Japanese pilots started their campaign in China, and then they gradually gained experience, and then they moved on to the battles against the Americans, like say Pearl Harbor, and then to the subsequent all the battles. They gained experience through those months, and then they got hit really hard on Midway, and then they moved on to the Solomons while they are conducting long-range flight, and then after they arrived to the battlefield, the Americans had the advantage of waiting them. So the veteran pilots were worn out, and they got killed quickly over the years. So in 1944, most of the Japanese pilots were much more inexperienced, and there were few veteran pilots around at the time. And so this leads to a direct consequence of the Japanese conventional attacks. Air raids against the American fleet were mostly ineffective, and the Americans were also upgrading its fleet with its new technologies, so they had a much more efficient anti-aircraft capabilities, and I will come back to that later. So these are the battles that happened in 1944. So, as we can see, from June of 1944, the U.S. forces landed in Saipan, kicking off the start of the campaign for the Mariana Islands. And several days later, 10 days later, the Japanese responded to this crisis by launching basically their entire fleet. There was a battle of the Philippine Sea, or in Japanese they call it Battle of the Marianas. But the U.S. pilots called it the Mariana Turkey Shoot, and I'll come back to that later. It was pretty fun. So that battle didn't turn out well for the Japanese. So a month and a half later, on August, the Japanese, the U.S. completed the capture of all these islands around their area. So they were planning for the invasion for the Philippines. And so what happened was, before they actually landed in the Philippines, there was another battle happened on October 12th and through 16th. It was the Formosa Air Battle. Something spectacular happened in that battle, and we'll come back to that later. You just need to bear in mind that all those three huge battles, Philippine Sea, Formosa, and Leyte Gulf, was the cause for the formation of the Kamikazes. And so the final battle, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, was the arguably the biggest naval battles in human history. And the Japanese threw all their available forces, but they still could not win those battles. So, what about the conventional attacks? I said they were getting ineffective in the later war stage, but what are those attacks? To attack a ship, you need to deliver your bombs accurately onto them, and so one way to do it is through dive bombing, as you can see from the this side, planes diving. So the dive bombers can carry a medium load of bomb, so that the plane can climb up to the high altitude first, and then they see the target and they dive drastically onto the target. and they will release a bomb at a rather shallow position so that the bomb can be delivered onto the target rather accurately. The problem, though, is that you need to build the plane durable to sustain the pressure and all these the forces that had on the planes while you are diving. So the plane cannot carry a huge ton of bombs, so the bomb load is actually relatively small. And so those bombs, when they hit the target onto the ship, they can mostly damage the superstructure, the upper side of the ships, like the towers, the bridges, the turrets, the guns. Not the ship itself, but those armaments and the personnel on the decks. So the dive bombing can really hit hard for the personnel on the ship, but not the ship itself. But a more lethal attacks for the ship are the torpedoes. So the torpedoes were delivered like a fish in the water. So after you release it, it will come down into the water and then travel in the waves and hit the side of the ship. And the torpedoes will usually really had a huge warhead, usually up to 1,000 kilograms, so that's literally a ton of explosives. And so when a torpedo hit the side of a ship, it will tear a big hole on the hull of the ship, and so the seawater will flood in, and then eventually the ship can be sunk by this way. The problem with this torpedo attacking was that your plane is usually built huge comparatively, because you need to carry a huge load of bombs, a torpedo. And also the safe way to deliver this torpedo is the plane needs to fly really close to the surface of the water, so that when you drop the torpedo, it will not get hit hard by the surface of water, so that the torpedo will not explode itself preemptively. And so the problem with the torpedo attacks is that the planes are coming in a rather stable approaching routes, and the AA guns, the anti-aircraft gunners on the ships can see you very clearly. They can predict your coming rather easily, so they can aim you at a rather accurate ways. For the dive bombing, though, the pilots has more chances of maneuvering and changing their positions while diving. So the dive bombers are rather hard to hit by the people on the ship. And for the Japanese, the problem is that it's 1944. It's the latest stage of the war, but they still had most of the planes are outdated compared to the more advanced American planes, and the inexperienced pilots and airmen were not able to deliver their arm loads, their bombs onto the targets accurately. So that's a problem. So the U.S. came up with several defensive mechanisms to counter the conventional attacks. To counter all those attacks. One big thing stand out is the radar technology. And the radar I'm talking about is not only just to detect the enemy from a distance far away, but also the radar technology can help you to locate the enemies, and then to send those informations, like the enemy coming air groups have a specific bearing and speed, which direction they're coming. They will send these information to the gun crews through director. Like on the screen, we have this Mark 74 one as an excellent example for the U.S. technology here. It's a gun director that have a radar onto it, so you can detect the enemy before your eyes. You can see them, and then you can send those information to the guns, to the anti-aircraft guns, and then they can shoot down the enemy more accurately. Another big way is the combat air patrol, or you can call them CAP if you want. The combat air patrol are the fighter squadrons that you have on a aircraft carrier. Usually, while the carrier group is operating on the sea, you will have some combat air patrols. Those squadrons of fighters will always cover your fleet. They will circle around your fleet as a screening force. So if the radar picks up anything, if say the radar pick up the incoming enemy aircraft, the combat air patrols will come up and meet the enemy first, and then if the enemy haven't got shot down, the AA guns will commit their fire. And so those are the American anti-aircraft guns they use in the war. On the left, we have 40mm Bofors guns, and that was me in the photo. And on the right, we have the 20mm Oerlikon machine guns. Those two types of guns were the best, arguably the best anti-aircraft guns in the war. They claimed the highest number of kills over the years, and so they were really the best weapon that you can have for defending the enemy aircraft. And especially the 40mm Bofors guns can load this type of shells, which is the VT proximity fuse Mach 53. So the usual shells were time diffuse. So if you release a shell after, say, several seconds, it will detonate itself. But for the proximity fuse, they basically put a tiny, well, I actually don't quite know about this physics behind it. So basically, they put a tiny bit of a transceiver and into these shells. They will send out waves, electromagnetic waves, to detect the enemy planes in surroundings. And if they detect that the enemy planes are close to the shells, so the shells are still flying, it will when you detect the enemy planes are coming near to it, it will detonate itself. So the VT shells can basically have an eyes to detect the enemies. So they don't have to actually hit on the aircraft, they just need to detonate around the aircraft, and then the shells will explode. You have some tiny shells in this whole big shell itself, so that those things will come out and damage the enemy aircraft. And so, combined with all these new technologies, the American fleet was able to defend itself against the incoming Japanese fleet. And so, let's compare the effectiveness of a conventional attacks and with the Kamikaze special attack. So this is from a famous naval historian called Norman Friedman. He said, if we have 120 planes for conventional attacks, basically 60% of them will be shot down by the combat air patrol, so that we have 48 remains to commit their attacks onto the fleet. And among all 48, 33% of them will be shot down by the anti-aircraft guns, so that we got 32 remains to approach its target and for the final attacks. Well, for the pilots, they need to deliver their bombs onto the target accurately, so you have around 15% chance of hit. That's actually pretty generous. So you've got 4.8 hits out of all 120 planes you send in. Basically, you got 5 hits, and you lost 88 planes. But what about the kamikaze attacks? We can do this reversely. Say if we need 5 hits, and let's say Norman Friedman actually said the hit rate was at 100%. We'll just say about 80%. We'll just give some leeway here. So we need 5 hits, and the hit rate was at 80%. So we need 6.25, or just say 7 hits. We need 7 planes to hit on the target. 7 planes to come in to approach the enemy ships. And among all the kamikaze attacks, 50% of them will be shot down by the anti-aircraft guns. So 14 planes need to come through the CAP, the CAP, the Combat Air Patrol, and 75% of them will be shot down by the Combat Air Patrol. So we need 56 planes in total to get 5 hits. Well, although you lost all of them, 56 planes, you got 5 hits. But for the conventional attack, you lost 88 planes to get 5 hits. So statistically speaking, yes, the kamikaze attacks were more effective than the conventional attacks. Because, well, the pilots were already thinking they can't really turn back, so they're gonna just go for it. And so let's come back to the battles. So this was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, as the Japanese called it, the second decisive battle. The first one was the Battle of Midway in June 42. At that time, the Japanese sent basically all its existing fleets to participate in that battle, even though not all of the ships were directly involved in the battle. But, well, we all know that Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers in that battle. It was a disaster for them. For the Philippine Sea, the Japanese also sent all of their available fleets onto the battle. The overall commander was the Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo. He came up with this kind of like a new form of attacking, was called the long-range attack. So what was that? That was basically the Ozawa was playing the advantage of their own planes. The Japanese planes were designed to fly a longer distance than most of the Allied planes. So Ozawa will launch his planes from the carriers a long range before the Americans actually did detect them. So he hoped the airmen would follow the scouts' lead and find the American fleet before the Americans can find them, because the carriers were holding a long distance from the battlefield. And so those planes that were launched will have not enough fuel to come back to the carrier itself, but Ozawa was ordered them to land and use those blades in Saipan and Guam. One problem with this idea is that it completely ignored the feelings of the pilots. Even though there were still some veteran pilots in his fleet, those pilots complained afterwards that flying for straight up 5 or 6 hours was intolerable for anyone. And plus, most of the rookie pilots at the time didn't have any idea where they should be going, and navigating on the sea was terrible and it's really difficult for anybody. And so many Japanese planes didn't even reach their target, or when they reached the target, the Americans were already waiting for them. The Americans were prepared, but the Japanese were flying for hours while the Americans just barely get up and took off from the carriers. So the Americans, as this picture showed, that it was a great day for the American pilots. It was they called it turkey shoot, because they shot down so many enemy planes, and they basically, Americans lost comparatively none to the Japanese. It was a disaster for the Japanese. They lost 3 carriers and in total 750 planes. So that was the defending for the landing of the Philippine Sea, for the Mariana Islands. It didn't turn out good for the Japanese. And move on was the Formosa air battle. So after the Americans captured all of the Mariana Islands, they move on to the Philippines. And so the Japanese were intercepting the American invasion fleet around Formosa. Well, now they would call it Taiwan. So the Japanese, in those 4 days of air battles, they claimed they sunk 11 American aircraft carriers and 2 battleships. They also heavily damaged 8 carriers, 2 battleships, and other ships. Well, guess what? The reality was not this at all. It was ridiculous for the Japanese. In reality, the United States Navy got 2 heavy cruisers damaged and only lost 89 planes. It was not only the combat missions, but also some accidents were involved. But the Japanese lost over 300 planes. And also noted here, the US Navy only started with 17 carriers, and the Japanese claim they sunk or damaged 19 carriers. So this is a rare situation in human history that not only the military publishes news to the public, as the propaganda needs it, and many people in Japan actually believe it. The Japanese Navy also fooled the army, that they told the army that we achieved great victory over the Americans in Formosa in this battle. But in reality, it was nothing. It was a humiliating experience for all the Japanese. And yeah, it's pretty bad for them. And so, with those battles in mind, we got this problem that all these conventional attacks were not being effective at all against the American fleet. The Japanese are losing too much pilots and planes, so we need to come up with a new idea, a new way to attack the Americans. So let us introduce some dramatic personnel for the formation of Kamikaze. Here we have Rear Admiral Arima Masafumi. He was a kind of like junior admiral in the fleet in the Japanese Navy. He was a commander of the 26th Air Flotilla on Luzon, Philippines. And he was those young guys that had a lot of ambitions for his career, and he wanted to do his duty to the country. And so when Arima and other young guys on the command staff saw this desperate situation for the Empire, they were thinking about why don't we order the pilots to crash their planes onto the enemy carriers, so that at least it will damage the aircraft deck, so that the Americans cannot operate their planes for at least several periods of time. So Arima was a strong supporter for this idea, and he actually committed the first kamikaze attacks on October 15th. So that was in the Formosa air battle. The thing is that he flew out with several other planes, heavy bombers, but he never came back. Obviously, the Americans reported that they shot on several of those heavy bombers, but the Americans received no damage at all. The Japanese, on the other side, said Arima and his aircrew completely sunk one American carrier. So the propaganda showed up that Arima as a example for all the Japanese, that he was willing to sacrifice his life as a junior commander of the Navy. He sacrificed his life and demonstrated to all the people around him that it was a time for us to do such a thing, to commit ourselves to this kind of almost crazy attacks. But his direct superior, this dude, Teroka Kimpei, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, disagreed with this kind of really dramatic ideas of committing kamikazes. And so he was originally proposed to this idea of saying he was basically he was more like a Yamamoto guy, that he was heavily influenced by the former commander-in-chief of the Navy, Yamamoto Isoroku, that he said, if I know this operation is doomed 100% to fail, or the pilots will 100% will not come back, I will not permit them to go. If I know they have even like 1% or 10% to come back, I will permit that. But kamikaze was a different thing. It was bound to be lethal, and the pilots are not expected to come back at all. So he opposed to that. and he wasn't really able to exert his influence and his command to the First Air Fleet because he was fired due to his incapability on the battlefield, especially commanding the air fleet for the Formosa air battle. We all know that turned out badly for him. So he got fired on October the 20th. So his successor, which was Onishi Takejiro, arrived onto Philippines on October the 20th. He was a bright dude, and he was a relatively, due to the other's memoir, he was a kind guy, a type of guy that shouldn't be have this bravery to say that the kamikaze thing should be funded. But anyway, many historians now call him the father of kamikaze because he was a guy who actually made this special attack into a core, made this tactics a real thing. So before all these, even Arima himself and people before him on the battlefield, there were times that like individuals will find themselves being in a desperate situation that they will have completely no chance to come back, so they will throw themselves completely onto the battlefield and basically commit suicide missions. But that was on the individual base. But right now, what Onishi was doing was making that into a systematic suicide missions. So he created this core, or this tactics to use. And so that's why we call him the father of this tactic. And after the war, he committed seppuku to apologize for all these young air crewmen died because he gave the order to do so. And so on the 20th, on October 20th, he came up to a airman on Philippines who is Seki Yukio, the aviator of 201st Flotilla, and he was a commander of his own unit. So he is, and he was a, Seki was a veteran pilot. He started the war as a dive bomber pilot, which he gained a lot of experience flying planes, and then he transformed into a fighter pilot in the later stage. And so he was on the Philippines, and so Onishi approached him and asked him to become the commander of this special attack corps. And there were many stories around about their conversations, but one version says Seki looked down and thought about for a dozen seconds and looked back to Onishi and said, "Yes, I will go." And another version I heard that he spent the whole night thinking about this, and then the next day he came out to Onishi to accept this. But anyway, he accepted this mission, and he was a commander, and he chose his fellow men for this mission. One day before their departure to the battle, one reporter found those guys, and he interviewed with Seki, and asking him, "Why are you going for this? Why are you going for this desperate, this kind of special attack?" He said, "I didn't go for the emperor or the empire. I went for my beloved wife." So during the whole interview, there wasn't many times that he mentioned the word emperor or the empire itself. So he was more talking about his own family, his life, and he basically said his wife just got pregnant before his departure to Philippines, and so he really wanted to protect his wife. And the one thing to bear in mind is that the Japanese propaganda in the wartime, really vilify and dehumanize Americans. They were saying that the U.S. Marines can only become a true soldier after they bayonet his friends or his relatives. So yeah, that was obviously completely not true, but it really created this image for the Japanese that the Americans are all beasts, and if the Japanese let the Americans landed onto Tokyo, the Americans will probably just rape every woman they saw on the street. Well, we know that probably not true. But so the Japanese soldiers will have this setting or thinking that they need to protect their family first. And especially with Seki, he didn't think about the country itself very much, but he think about his family first. So this is a common thing we will see for the Kamikaze pilots, that many of them weren't really that nationalistic. But obviously there were some of them super nationalistic about this. But there were parts of them that weren't that much, but they were doing it for protecting their beloved ones. And so Seki and his crews went on to the mission on October 25th. There were 5 planes, so 5 pilots from the Shikishima squadron. All of them landed themselves onto the target. USS St. Louis was a escort carrier, sunk due to the magazine explosion, and 3 other escort carriers, White Plains, Kakina Bay, and Kitcom Bay, was damaged. So apparently there were 2 planes hit onto the same target, but we can see 5 planes, only 5 planes. They destroyed 1 carrier and heavily damaged 3 others, which was completely unexpected by everyone. And the result was fantastic for merely 5 people. And so let's take a look at the formation after that. So as we can see, there were 3 phases, I would say, for the from the October 15 to 24th. That was basically the Battle of Leyte Gulf. There was the last concentrated bombing formations. So those were the conventional attacks that came in large numbers of planes. The Japanese suffered heavy casualties, and those attacks were mostly ineffective due to American highly effective anti-aircraft guns and the combat air patrols. And so there were seldom some kamikaze committed like Seki and his crews, but and also Arima. And so after that, the phase 2 happened from October all the way to February, that the Japanese will obviously upgrading their tactics. They will usually come up with 1 group of 3 to 6 planes, and another group of 6 to 15 planes, 2 groups of kamikaze attacks. 2 groups are maneuver separately, but they will in the same battle zone, and they will have the same target. And so after they saw the enemy, they will break out formation, and each plane will evade individually. And they also use cloud cover and use a shallow dive to approach the enemy in a more surprised way. And also starting from the later October battles, the Japanese will not only send out the kamikaze attacks, the planes, and also some regular fighter planes as air cover. As we can see from the movie, at the end we see the 3 planes returning. Those are the air covers. And the phase 3 is from the February of 45 all the way to May, and subsequently to the end of the war, was they create this tactics. They evolved it as massive raids. They have more complex ways to for the deceptions, like dropping chaff, which was a way to make the American radar screens go basically blind. And so they were also sending multiple levels of attacks. They will have different planes coming in different altitude and directions and bearings. They will attack from different time zones, and so it was really complex. And they use different types of planes, and the idea was to overwhelm the American CIC Combat Information Center. And I will read you a quote from the book of Norman Friedman. Quote, "The supervisor in the CIC Combat Information Center had to judge the targets on the plot, deciding which was most threatening before assigning one to a fighter director. The time lags evolved in plotting and using information build-up as more and more separate raids appeared. Those in the CIC had no way of knowing how accurate their picture was, but at some point the picture would be so far off that it could no longer be an effective basis for directing fighters. So the idea was to have too many planes coming in all together from different levels, different directions, and the Americans had no way to know which one they should intercept first, so that the Japanese created themselves a chance to hit the enemies. And those are the planes used. What are the common thing in them? Well, many of you already knew those are all the Zero fighters, even though the picture shows different models like 22, 32, and 52. But the idea was that most of the fighter planes used for Kamikazes was still Zero fighters, which was developed before the war and entered service for all the duration of the war, so they were already outdated for battles in 44 and 45. And those are the planes that mostly used like Zero fighters and the early models of dive bombers and torpedo bombers, but there were also some strange new things coming up for these type of attacks. One of them is, I will call them a low-tech and high-tech. So the low-technology thing is the Yokosuka K5Y Willow. It's a biplane. It's for the training purpose, and they were painted orange, so the Japanese call them Red Dragonfly, so that as a trainee you can see your plane or the other plane in the formation really clearly due to the orange painting on the plane. The problem is that those biplanes were often piloted by the experienced trainers, and they would volunteer for the kamikaze attacks. Those wooden planes were lightweighted, and so they are really easy to maneuver. And comparatively to the more advanced planes like Zeros, those biplanes had a really slow speed, so they can sneak in onto the American fleet and from a really low altitude. So those planes were really suited for night attacks, while the Americans were most vulnerable to attacks because most of the crewmen were resting. And also the planes were coming really shallow from the shallow angle and altitude, so the radar often did not detect them quickly. So I'll read you a quote from the reports at the time. Said, quote, "The ability of those old biplanes to absorb punishment is surprising. Numerous machine gun hits, including 50 mils, 20 mils, and 50 counts were observed on those planes, which attack at 0145 at ranges of 200 to 400 yards, but the bullets caused little apparent damage. Although a number of VT burst proximity fuses were evident in the plane's vicinity on both rounds, competent observers say that the bursts were on the other side of the target, those bursts causing no apparent damage. So the VT shells had problems shooting at them, and the regular machine gun bullets can just pass through those woods and come out. The bullets did not explode itself, so that the plane actually got relatively low damage. And those planes resulted in the sinking of USS Callahan, a destroyer, and another destroyer, Kathleen Young, was heavily damaged. Kathleen Young was still around here in the US as a museum ship. You can visit her. I visited her last year. It was great. You can see her battle wound from this attack. And another nuance was the high-tech of a Yokosuka MXY-7 Orca, or Orca means cherry blossom. It's a human-guided rocket, basically a rocket bomb. And so those rocket bombs were made of wood and non-critical metal alloys, and so they were not completely wooden though, but they were still likely to be immune to proximity fuses. And so the way you have those bombs set up was that you will attach them to the conventional bomber, the huge G4M Batty bomber, and the Batty would fly in formations with air covers onto the battlefield, and when they see the American fleet, they will drop this human control bomb, and those bombs will proceed to the target. And these bombs were designed with a huge warhead of 120 kilograms or 260 pounds of warheads of explosives, and you got a top speed of 660 kmp or 400 mph, which was extremely fast for planes at the time. And I have a clip from an anime, in the golden time of anime from the 80s, that show you the attack of Oka, the cherry blossom.
敵だ！敵情報探知のり敵！前期戦闘態勢に入れ！左後ろ情報にも敵！太陽から敵や！突っ込んでくる！かかれ！撃たれた日本機を叩き落とせ！潜り込まれた！ダイブして突っ込む！隙間いらん！ 切り離せ。身軽になるんだ。
バカ、まだ敵艦が見えん。お前を切り離すのは敵艦が見えてからだ。
また軍刀。来る来る来る。もう結構だ。早く切り離してくれ。ははは、まだ止めるぜよ。切り離せ。ジェリーブロッサム、とどめだ。アンバード、右方向上に敵だ。うわあ、敵が見えた。ありがとう。もう平気だ。ありがとう。野上、あとは任せたぞ。野上。はあ。あいつね、ロケットを全部いっぺんに展開していきよった。すまん。敵一機、ロケットが突入してきます。何？チェリーブロッサム、人間爆弾だ。ダメだ、早すぎる。やつは音速を超えていたのか。音が後から来たぞ。おお。
So yeah, basically that is a visual representation of how those human rockets works. But just to be aware that this is a fiction work, and in reality, those bombs didn't really hit anything big. There was one instance where a American destroyer was hit, severely damaged by this, but there were no aircraft carriers got hit by this bomb. And as you can see in the anime, the big old Betty bomber is very vulnerable to enemy attacks, so most of them will be eliminated before they even reach the target, before they reach their combat area. So those bombs and what I said, they were high techs, but they were really just a kind of a novelty, but not really super useful. But anyway, I think this anime is pretty awesome. Maybe you can check them out. And so, despite all of these, so what the Americans reacted to all those attacks, from whether or not it's Zero fighters or the old Type 99 and 97 bombers, or the low tech and the high tech I just mentioned. So one way is a rather passive way is to defend yourself. Well, how do you defend yourself? That's to set up a radar picket station. So all in one picket line, you will have 3 destroyers for LCS, landing craft support to compose one picket line station, and you would put those picket lines at the front of your fleet near the enemy base. So what they're gonna do is that all those ships are capable of they have radar detection technology on board, so they're gonna be detecting the incoming Japanese aircrafts and send early warning to the main fleet that was behind them, basically composed of battleships and aircraft carriers. So those picket lines will also send and signal and direct the combat air patrols directly. So whenever they saw there was an incoming Japanese air groups, they're gonna call for the cap, and the cap will come forward and intercept those Japanese planes. Noted here that those ships were specifically instructed not to open fire easily, because especially in nighttime, because if you open fire in nighttime, it's very easy to spot you from a far distance away, because you are creating so many blasting and lightning and suns. You know, it's really easy to find you as a Japanese pilot. And so their main roles is to direct the combat air patrols aircrafts not to open fire directly. But that's really hard to do. That really depends on the captains. The captains on the station, they're gonna decide whether they should react to enemy incoming aircrafts. So those ships on the picket station suffered heavy casualties, as you might guess, because they were the closest to the enemies, and especially for the picket line station number 1 at Okinawa campaign, they were only like they were really close to the shore, so I don't have the exact number of how far they were, but the average lifetime for a destroyer on that position was 6 hours. So when a destroyer retreated from that position, it's alive and healthy. The captain of that destroyer sent back a radio to the rear, said, "Well, see, we survived that. We survived more than 6 hours. We got 8 hours." Yeah, so this is a really effective way to direct your combat air patrol, because you're not risking your main fleet as the carriers in the rear, but you have those destroyers and landing crafts at the front, but they also have the ability to do the same as the carriers do. And so I have a report from those pilots that got instructed from the radar picket station, and their reaction about the incoming Japanese planes. Quote, this report is from the VF-30 squadron from the carrier USS Bellewood, and the report said, quote, "Pilots report that the Japanese fighter planes encountered did not return fire and appeared very inexperienced. When 2 were called together, they split instead of trying to protect each other. They use no evasive maneuvers except speed in attempt to dodge into clouds. No slow rolls or other maneuvers were generally resorted to. And end quote. And also noted, none of the enemy bombers actually carried their customary rear gunners. So yeah, the American pilots were really astonished and shocked by how the Japanese pilots were inexperienced at the time. The rookie pilots don't even know how to do evasive maneuvers because they were usually pressed into service after they learned how to take off their planes. So yeah, they don't know how to cover each other, they don't know how to evade, so they got shot down really quickly. And now another way to defend your fleet, it's a more direct and aggressive approach, is to destroy the enemy base before they can even send out the kamikaze attacks. So this gentleman here, some people may know him, but I guess not all of you or the audience know him. He is John Thatch, the famous pilot, I would argue the most famous American pilot in the war. John Thatch, he created his famous Thatch weave tactics against the Japanese Zero fighters, and that proved really well. And later on, he invented this blanket system, which is basically a 3-strike system. So what he did was that he said we need our aircraft carriers to form up 3 groups of attacking aircraft. They will take off from different times and engage the enemy at different times, but the goal is to have a continual and constant raid on the enemy bases, land base or either the carriers. So what they're gonna do is that you're gonna split all your aircraft into 3 groups. Let's just name it A, B, C. And the A group and B group will take off at the same time, say 0600. A group will carry with bombs target at the enemy ships or land base, those explosive bombs. But the B group will not carry those bombs. Instead, they will have their regular machine gun bullets and some rockets in order to suppress the enemy combat air patrols, if there's any, or to suppress the enemy AA guns. And so those 2 groups will take off at the same time as, say, 0600, and they will arrive at the enemy target at, say, 0715. The group A will proceed to attack for 15 minutes only. They will do this as quick as they can, and they will depart the combat zone at 0730 after the strike. So they will spend the next an hour to get back to their carrier, so they will land at 0830. But the Group B will remain at the combat zone there to continue to suppress the enemy airfield and to bomb the enemy, suppress the enemy AA gun abilities. So from 0715, they're gonna stay there for basically an hour and 40 minutes long. They can only retreat at 0910, and so they're gonna return to base at that time. But remember, there's a Group C. The Group C will also carry bombs against the targets. They will take off at 0800, so 2 hours after the first 2 groups took off. An hour later, they will arrive at the combat zone at 0920. So remember, the Group B only departed at 0910, so that means the Group B left, but then 10 minutes later, the another group arrived. This only gave the Japanese only 10 minutes to react, and usually the Group C, those pilots will report that they saw the Japanese were dragging out their planes from the entrenched positions or the caves, and they were hastily trying to repair the damaged airfields, but that's too late for them because Thatcher invented this brilliant idea of this continual attacks that the Japanese have no time to react and repair their bases, and that was a great way to oppress your enemy when they don't have the ability to completely to engage you. And so after all these, let's talk about the actual impact of this tactics, because we were all talking about the nuance and details. Now we are going into some bigger we took a look at this thing from a bigger perspective. So the technical impact of these kamikazes were, well, you can say the numbers are really high from certain perspectives. 30 to 50 ships were sunk by these tactics. The number varied because the data varied, and we have still many documents to be analyzed, and many historians have given different numbers. But I would say it's safe to say that between these numbers, and especially the confirmed cases where 3 escort carriers and 14 destroyers were definitely destroyed by kamikaze planes. But then those are the ships sunk, but then over 300 ships were damaged, including all the landing crafts and transport ships. And there were 1,500 American, the Allies' casualties in total. In return, over 4,000 kamikaze pilots never returned. So, yeah, from the numbers you can see it's a really heavy pressure on the Allies' navy. This tactics distracted more planes to the Allied planes to combat combat air patrol and the escort duties. And so this really created some technical problems for the Allies during their landing campaigns, especially because all those fighter planes were diverted into CAP, so they were unable to support the landings. And so they basically overwhelmed the Allied CIC center. But what about if we take a even bigger perspective? If we see from a strategic level, what's the impact here? So these charts are from the Japanese combinedfleet.com, a great site. You can check them out. So this is a warship production during all those 4 and 5 years of combat. As you can see here, the US basically built over 100 aircraft carriers of all types, including fleet carriers, escort carriers, and converted carriers. For Japanese, they could only achieve 17 of these. And so losing 3 escort carriers and 14 destroyers, you can see the number here. It's not really a huge big deal for the US Navy because they have the ability to really replace those damaged or sunk ships, while the Japanese couldn't. And if you're not really good at numbers, there's a chart from Military History Visualize, a great YouTuber. I got this screenshot from one of his video. I will have the link down in the description. As you can see, the American build with the blue signs here, and the Japanese were red signs, and the American production is just way higher than the Japanese. So they have the ability to replace their sunken ship. And here is the merchant ships. Basically, the US built almost 10 more times merchant ships as the Japanese did. And this is the chart for aircrafts. The US basically built 5 more times the aircraft than the Japanese did. So losing some for the Allies, especially for the United States, isn't gonna be so huge a problem because the productions were capable of replacing this damage. And also on the personnel level, the US Navy recruited a lot of people during the wartime, and most of them got put into service in 44 and 45, so not a huge problem for the US Navy. So I would say on the strategic level, the impact of kamikaze was limited. And I have a quote from a historian called Rielly, and I feel like this quote is quite fitting for here. Quote, "Kamikaze attacks, rather than being frenetic missions launched by madmen, were actually the only possibility for the Japanese to prevent the invasion of their homeland. They were the only rational means by which it could be demonstrated to the Americans that an invasion of Japan would be too costly." End quote. So this is exactly what Onishi and his staff were thinking about when creating this special attack corps. It's intended as a prevention of the invasion of homeland. The thinking is that because they presumed that the Americans are all prefers individualism, and they think their personal life is higher than anything else. So the Japanese assumed that if we gave the Americans enough damage, enough casualties, the press back in the U.S. will call the military and the government to end this war, to find a peaceful way to end this war, because they don't want to see more of their sons got killed. But that was not true for the Americans at the time. The U.S. was unprecedentedly united and had this determined faith to overcome this problem by the Axis, caused by the Axis, and to solve this problem forever. And so, as you can see, these tactics, including those banzai attacks on the islands done by the Japanese army, it cost greatly for the American lives. But then the American people actually wanted to end the war as soon as possible. By what means, though? And we all see right now is that, well, the American dropped the atomic bombs. That really helped to end the war, no matter which way we look at it. So the invasion of a home island was not gonna happen anytime soon, even though they did have the plan for that. So yeah, that was the thinking of the Japanese, that maybe we can prevent them from landing, but that actually worked the other way for them. The Americans actually wanted to land on the homeland, but they chose the bombs, which would, I would say, save more American soldier lives. Then what about the mentality for these things, for the Japanese? What about how the Japanese actually think about these? Here's a photo that I put on the first page of my of the presentation. This young pilot is called Araki Yukio. He was barely 17 when he was on his final mission to hit the USS Brine, a destroyer, on May 27th, 45, during the Okinawa campaign. I think only 2 or 3 months ago he turned 17. He's probably the youngest documented, recorded Japanese pilots flown the kamikaze attacks. But because this is the only one that got documented for such a young age, we don't know if there's anyone younger than him that actually flew these missions. And so the Japanese, the parents for these pilots were actually more or less regretted the choices by their sons, but they didn't really specifically say, no, this is bad, and we shouldn't die. Our kids shouldn't die like that. It was only a regret that they chose to die like that, instead of questioning who caused all of these. And so yeah. And another thing that you need to understand, that not all the Japanese teenagers and young adults at the time were sacrificing themselves for the country. As you can see, some of them actually were defending their homeland, rather their family, instead of the cause for the country. But more or less, what I read about the memoirs from those surviving pilots is that you have this peer pressure. When you saw like 80% of your guys from your squadron raise their hand to say yes to go on such a mission, the rest of them saw this and feel the pressure. If I don't sign up and volunteered for these missions, I will be regarded as a coward and being treated badly after war. So why not just sign up for this mission? Because whether or not I'm signed up for the mission, if the Americans actually landed in Japan, I'm probably gonna be dead no matter what. So yeah, so not all of them were were quite volunteered for these missions. Some of them were even pressed into the aircraft by the military, by their superiors. There were definitely records of that. But yeah, just being remembered, it's a complex reason to join these special attack corps, and it's really a sad story that many of them died that way because their superior asked them to do this, not due to they actually want to sacrifice themselves. Because the nature of human is to preserve yourself, and yeah. What about the US? The US thought these pilots were absolutely insane. They were confused and they didn't imagine such a thing could happen. Well, but if you look at the Japanese brutality and cruelty against other people in Asia, especially with the rape of Nanking and the Batam Death March, it's not so. If I'm a US soldier or someone else who know that things like that happened before, I won't be super shocked. But, well, for the soldiers on the battlefield, it was a shock. It was totally unimaginable. And so the Americans never, during war, most of them didn't quite understand this, so they accused Japanese after the war. And some of the people right now even compared kamikaze attacks with the modern terrorists. But I would say there's a difference between them. The terrorists were, sometimes they were doing for religious reasons or other various different reasons, but the Japanese were doing this more or less due to the situation on the battlefield, because they could not win the war. They need to find a way to solve these problems. The ultimate responsibility, though, falls on the Japanese superiors, especially with people like Onishi, those guys. They send those young soldiers into death. They didn't give them a choice at all. So those are the people that should be really responsible of, not those young Japanese pilots. They had their difficulties on the hand. They got pressed into the service and died for the emperor, quote unquote. But yeah, it's really sad. And also, well, many people look at this thing, this subject from, Ruth Benedict's famous book, the Chrysanthemum and the Sword, because she basically explained to the Americans about this Bushido spirit and the code of samurai. But I will argue here, there's definitely some influence, because the Japanese they have this spirituality and mind in their roots, this Bushido spirit. But for modern Japan, especially in the wartime Japan, I would say the political propaganda actually contributed more to the thinking of, I'm going to die for the country, or die for the emperor himself, because Japanese, after Meiji restorations, they were really westernized, and they call them modernized, but it's more westernized, and so some of them actually abandoned those ancient traditions. And I feel like, especially with kids that are born in the 20s and they joined the war in the 40s, they were more influenced by the government, and the modern Japanese government, the imperial government, and its propagandas. Yeah. So I have some more interesting things, especially with a interview from a Japanese kamikaze pilot from BBC.
美しい国土を守るために行かなきゃいけないんだ。これも宿命だ。これは諦めざるを得ないと。もう避けられない。これも運命だと。 今日は俺の最後の日だなと思いながら飛んでおったら、途中でブスンブスンブスンババッババッ黒い煙が出るわけですよね。望んだ事態になったという、命が惜しくて帰ってきたって言われるんじゃなかろうか。
Stupidity. Courageous.
Irrational.
No.
当時としては国のためですよ。だからそれはね、英雄ですよ。だけども現在なってみるとね、あの人たちにも私と同じような開ける人生があっただろう。本来ならばそれが待ったをかけられるべき事態じゃないのに、そういうね、国のためという名目のもとにね、命を散らしたって本当残念だったなと今でもそう思います。
And so, yeah, what he said was really basically summarized this lecture here, is that it was a sad thing, and the Japanese at the time really considered those pilots were heroes. But if it's not for the war, they could have been survived, and they will have a more prosperous and a more good-looking future for themselves. And here, on the final low note, I will have a easier thing for you guys to take away. This is a survey done in 2015. Would you fight for your country? And only 11% of the Japanese people said we will fight for their country, because modern Japan is much more peaceful, and especially with the after-war settlement, they no longer have a military. Well, they have a self-defense force. They are armed, granted, but the popular was against war, completely against war. Most of them were anti-war and anti-nuclear weapons, and especially because they were the only country in the human history that got hit by the nuclear bomb. So yeah, let's be peaceful again. Like, humanity should be united, and I think from a quote that I got from my history teacher, let's make tea, not make war. Thank you. Thank you for listening for my rambling about this topic, and thank you for your continuous patience throughout this lecture. And I will have all my researched books and videos. I'll have citation down below in the section, in the description section. And if you have any questions, please post them down below here. And yeah, so thank you, and I will see you next time with another lecture. Thank you, and have a good day.